The first person I thought of as, who do I know in San Diego that's just going to be amazing at this sort of thing? And I thought of our first storyteller. He is a speaking coach and a motivational speaker. You can find him online at miloshapiro.com, which is no coincidence because his name is Milo Shapiro. Come on, Milo.
There are times in life to fight the good fight, to argue your case, to stand your ground. And then there are times when we should recognize that we all have blind spots and other people know more than us, and maybe we should quit while we're ahead. This is one of those stories. But first, a little background. I went to a really good high school. It was just a public school, but one of the better ones on Long Island, very well respected. And these were in the days before we were worried about leaving any children behind. At least at the expense of the rest of the class, we were more concerned about them for some reason. In fact, I'm pretty sure at Syosset High School, the theory was, you mess with our college placement record, we will leave you behind. We had a system called tracking. Track 1 students were the accelerated ones, and we made sure there was a program for them where they could really excel, get into good school to make Syosset High School look good in retrospect. Track 2 was for average students or those who just weren't motivated enough to do the work for Track 1. And Track 3 was for those who either needed a little extra help or more often for whose behavior couldn't even handle Track 2. I was not one of the smartest kids in my high school by any stretch, but I worked hard. I would have done anything to stay in those Track 1 classes. Why? Because they tended to be bully-free. There just don't tend to be a lot of geek bullies. The hallways were hellish enough for me, but once I got to my classrooms, usually I felt safe because I didn't have to deal with any of those big, intimidating guys or girls, as the case may be. I was safe in there, except of course PE, when we had to deal with the nightmare of dodgeball under the sadistic glee of the former Track 3 students who had become PE coaches, but that's another story. All of this background for you scientists is to understand that some administrator along the way decided in our district that Track 1 students would skip 9th grade earth science and go directly into biology. The logic behind this was that then they could take 10th grade chemistry, 11th grade physics, and in 12th grade they could do this new thing that had started recently called AP Science, get college credit, and make Syosset High School look good. This made sense on the surface. What these administrators never took into account was that their best and their brightest, and me, might need to have an understanding of how the earth worked. Because, unless the hallway threats of killing me at dodgeball came to be true, I was going to spend a few more decades on this planet, and it would have been good to understand it. But, consequently, I never got to take that course. And so because of that, 30-something years later, there are still things about the Earth and that aspect of science that are mysterious to me. Things I've come to learn other people know. And what's worse is sometimes I think I know the truth about how things work when actually I am way off base. But I figured I didn't have to worry about that so much because Long Island is not prone to most of what you learn in earth science anyway. There are no tornado warnings at Syosset High School. There are no earthquakes at the Walt Whitman Mall. There are no volcanoes at the Levittown Community Pool. For the most part, I knew the basics. Summer would be hot. Winter would be cold. Sometimes you had to move your blanket back at the beach because of something called tides. I didn't know how they work, and let's face it, does anyone really understand how tides work? The moon's involved, we all know that's the case, but why twice a day? Once a day, maybe it pulls and it lets it. Why twice? I'm sure there's scientists here who on the break could explain it to me, but the bottom line was, I was a Long Island kid, I was probably going to get a job in the city, and as anyone in the city knows, the Earth is just something that revolves around Manhattan, and that's all you needed to know. Besides, I was 14 and there were plenty of other people to take care of the Earth. That wasn't my responsibility. My job at 14 was to memorize Monty Python routines for the lunchtime table, to get up early enough on Sunday, to look in the paper and find out what songs I needed to tape for free off Casey Kasem's Top 40 Countdown, and to master my lip syncing of REO Speedwagon songs in the bathroom mirror. And of course, getting ready for college. College, that sweet vision of that place where track 3 students weren't allowed. And PE, a distant nightmare, perhaps an elective that I would not elect. In 7th grade, toward the end, it occurred to me I should pick my college. And I correctly picked at the end of 7th grade exactly where I would go, because I realized I was never going to have the grades, and my parents were never going to have the money for an Ivy League school, but that if I worked hard, I would get into those top 4 state universities in New York. So I opened up the map, put myself on it, and went, Binghamton, too small. Buffalo, 5-foot snowdrifts, no thanks. Stony Brook, wow, that's close to my parents. That left one option. Albany, my future, my destination, my outlet. And that is where I went 5 years later. I picked it right in 7th grade. When I got to Albany, there was a bit of a shock to it. I met people from the other side of Manhattan, that rest of the state that I had ignored all my life. And the small towns around Long Island are around New York are very different from Long Island. Some really small towns. I had a roommate, there was 5 of us in a room, 4 Long Islanders and the one we called Tex. Even though he was a New Yorker, for some reason, people in small towns in New York sound like they're from the South. I've never understood that. And one day he came in, he was reading a letter, he was all excited because they had just installed a yield sign in the middle of his town. Not a traffic light, a yield sign was a topic of conversation where Tex came from. Then there was Wendy, who after getting to know me a little bit, looked at me and went, "You're my first Jew." Apparently none had ever even gone through the town of Amber, New York in any of her 18 years. Another side story on Wendy was, as I was heading home for Thanksgiving the next month, she said, "I didn't know Jews celebrated Thanksgiving." I said to her, "What part of the New Testament do you think it covers?" She stopped a minute and then she laughed at herself and said, "Oh, I get it, you're Americans too." Had to love her, she just had things to learn. And then there was Elon. Elon was my friend from sophomore year on. Elon, we couldn't have been more different. He called me city boy, I called him country boy. Our lives were totally different. And he and his brothers still own that farm that he grew up on outside of Albany by about an hour in Hoosick Falls. And he was different, but he let me know in his own little subtle ways, not so subtle, when he would say, "Rural don't mean dumb." He was clear about that, and he was as bright as anyone there, and that's why we started a friendship that's lasted over 30 years. Well, sophomore year, he said to me, "Why don't we take Geology 101? That should be an easy A." I said, "Yeah, it should," not thinking, I don't know anything about earth science, but I could catch up, I could learn this. For him, it was easy. The land, the earth, that was his world. To me, I was fairly certain that trees grew and boulders didn't, but I wouldn't have bet my lunch on it. But I figured I could do this. Well, it was hard. There was a lot of catching up. So we're cramming for a midterm. We're looking at a map that had been drawn by the professor and had letters in different places that represented different geographical things we were supposed to recognize. You know, A was a plateau, B was a lagoon, C was a delta, things like that. So Elon says to me, "Okay, what's happening at point G?" Well, I now know that what was happening at point G is that's where 2 streams were coming from together, probably going down a mountain, and making a smaller river and going out to the sea. Now I know that. But at the time, well, maps are flat. There isn't anything on a map to tell you where things start or finish, so I saw it as the reverse. So I said to him, "Map G, that's where that river coming from the water source was splitting up into 2 little streams." And he said, "What?" I said, "Yeah, the water coming from the ocean up that river, splitting into 2 streams, and then if you follow them, they split up into the little lines until they eventually fade out and become nothing. Because that's how it looked to me on the map." He looked at me and said, "You don't believe that, do you?" Thinking it was just me putting him on. Now this would have been the point where I could have easily said, "Am I wrong? But tell me, but why would I think I was wrong?" So I said, "Well, sure, what's wrong with my idea?" He said, "Rivers running from the ocean." Again, he's putting me on. I know he's got to be. Why wouldn't he? That's Elon. So I said, "Well, of course the water's coming from the ocean. Where else would all that water come from?" He looked at me incredulously, because this is when he realized just how ignorant I was, and he said, "Rain, rain, it's coming from rain." Again, a good place I could have gotten out, but that's where I thought I had it, because that made no sense to me. And that's when I said this line, "Oh sure, it rains enough to make the Mississippi River." That was the line that would be repeated throughout the dorm, as it turns out, over and over again. He stared me with a look and said, "Then how do you explain that rivers are fresh water?" Now, I am not sure, this many years later, that I actually had any clue what the content of a river was. And in salt water, muddy water, anyway, I have not, in my defense, you can look at a map of New York, there are no rivers on Long Island. I could tell you the contents of a roller rink, a movie theater, a mall, but rivers were not my specialty. But in that moment, a voice went off in my head from the past. Was it a teacher? No, I never got to take that class. Was it my parents? No, they just assumed I had logic and would figure things like that. No, where I learned things was commercial jingles. And in that moment, a supermarket jingle from some point in my life went, "Freshwater river salmon," because it had been on sale that week at some supermarket. And that's when I realized, oh, he's right, because of the freshwater river salmon commercial. And I couldn't come up with anything. And he broke out into a big smile and said, "Oh, you are never gonna live this one down." And he left. And Elon was bright, smart, likable, funny, good-looking. Everybody knew him, which made him the Facebook of 1984. So over the next few weeks, I got to hear about those salty rivers, or the sharks that showed up in the mountains, or my favorite, the tsunami that hit the Catskills. All because at no point in there did I give up to someone who clearly knew more than me. So one of the times in my life, I came to the realization that sometimes you gotta quit while you're ahead. Thank you very much.